Hi everybody, this is Victoria Bhavsar at the Faculty Center for Professional Development and the e-learning team, and welcome to the 5-week dash, which is summer 2018. And this is a recorded version of a talk that I gave in person in our face-to-face summer 5-week dash workshops in April, May, and earlier in March. And thanks for being with me online. Now, as you know, summer at Cal Poly Pomona 2018 is a bit different than other summers. We only have one summer session, and it is a 5-week session. We have no 10-week session. And students who have only 2 classes, 8 credits to go in their program, and then they could graduate, have been encouraged to take the 5-week session so that they can finish their programs and go ahead and graduate before changing to semesters. And so the university has provided some incentives for faculty to teach summer courses so that students can go ahead and take them and finish up. But that means that a lot of people who haven't taught 5 weeks before are going to be teaching 5-week classes now. And it's fairly high stakes because if students fail these summer classes, that's a bigger deal for them than it would be in almost any other summer. And so here are some best practices for teaching 5-week compressed classes. So honestly, there isn't a whole lot of research out there about how to teach compressed courses. We have a lot of research, lots of comparative studies, a great deal of robust research on how to teach normal length classes, like a 10-week or a semester-long course. But there's been a lot less actual research on how compressed format courses work. But that said, I think that there is some literature out there about best practices for teaching 5-week or compressed format courses. And it kind of all boils down to the quality of our interactions with our students determines our success. So a good summer class can be a very, very positive experience for students and for faculty. It can be really fun. You spend a lot of time together. You both really focus. You get to know each other well. And if in a good class, that's great. In a not so good class, that makes for a very long 5 weeks that nobody's really happy about. And so those best practices can really help us to have that good experience for everybody. So here we go. So the 4 kinds of best practices we're going to talk about will begin with restructuring the content and focus on the things that students must know and put your hard topics early. Second thing is to reconfigure your assignments. Early feedback. It's really easy for students to get behind in a 5-week class. We know it's easy for them to get behind in a 10-week quarter class, even worse for a 5-week class. And also you'll need to deconstruct large assignments and probably reduce the scope of them a little bit. Positive social behaviors is the third thing that we'll talk about. So student-faculty interaction and student-to-student interaction and reciprocity are really critical to making a summer class be a good experience. And finally, we'll talk about organization and planning, because you have to plan out the entire term before the first day of class. There is no time to wing it in a compressed format course. And also you need to talk to students and coach them on their time management because it's a very different pace for them too. So these are the 4 overall topics that we'll be talking about, and we'll touch on each of them in a little more detail. Before we get into that though, I just want to show you what a student week in summer at Cal Poly Pomona might look like. So most of our students are going to be taking 2 summer classes, which I think is a lot actually. And here is a week that your student's week might look like. I made this up, but it does follow some of the time modules that we'll have. So you see, this is a week from Sunday to Saturday. On Sunday, this hypothetical student is working at their job for 8 hours. On Monday, their first class is from 8 to 10. Their second class is from 10 to 12. And then they have a lab for that first class from 1 to 4. And then they go back and they work at their job some more. On Tuesday, they have class 1 and class 2, and then lab for class 2. On Wednesday, they have class 1, class 2, lab 1, and back to work. And Thursday, it goes on with more classes and labs. And then finally, Friday, they don't have any classes, but they're going to be working at their job. And on Saturday, they'll be working at their job. So just kind of laying all of this out and seeing, wow, there is no time for me to ask my students to do a lot of work in between classes can be a real eye-opener. Now, of course, your class time modules may be different than what I have shown here. Maybe you meet your class for 4 hours a day, twice a week, instead of for 2 hours a day, 4 times a week. Maybe you don't have a lab. Maybe you have a longer lab. I don't know. Anyway, just map out your class and perhaps think about the other courses that your students might be taking, if you have any idea, and think, gosh, how does this look when I actually put it on the calendar with the other things that I know my students are doing? And of course, this calendar doesn't take into account commuting or sleeping or interacting with family or anything else that anybody might want to do. But it can just be a real eye-opener to map out a week. So anyway, we see why our courses have to change a little bit, even though it's the same amount of class time in 5 weeks as it is in 10 weeks. Okay, so the examples that I'm going to give you are actually not from me. They're from my colleague Emily Magruder, who was an English professor at CSU Dominguez Hills before she moved to the Chancellor's office. And she taught 3 different courses in compressed formats. So these are all humanities courses, but, so if you're in a STEM discipline, please just use your imagination and think how what Emily did might apply in some way to your course. So first she taught Humanities 200, Intro to the Humanities, and she taught that in a full-length semester format, and then she taught it in a 6-week compressed format. She taught Humanities 310, Success and Values in the U.S., in a semester format, a 6-week format, and a 2-week format, which must have been a heck of a sprint. And then finally, English 108, Interracial Encounters, and she taught that in a 10-week format and in a 6-week format. So Emily brought a lot of experience to what I am going to tell you about what she did in one of these classes anyway. All right. So the first thing when you restructure content is to start with your learning objectives for your course. So if you haven't thought about learning objectives or you haven't clarified learning objectives, you really do need to do that first. And there's 3 kinds of learning that we have in class. One is they must know. They must know this content or must have this skill in order to meet the overall learning objectives of the class and be able to go on. So that's the must know. The should know is not absolutely fundamental and critical, but gee, they really should know that stuff if they want to call themselves having passed this class or having gotten a good grade in this class. And then finally, there's the nice to know stuff. And honestly, that is where professors tend to live. We are experts. We already know all of that must know and should know stuff. And what we like to talk about is the nice to know stuff, which tends to be, the latest research results or the most interesting case studies. So when you're thinking about what you'll need to cut, and you will need to cut content, even though that you have the same amount of class meetings, go back to your learning outcomes and think, gosh, what are the absolute must-knows, and then what are the really important should-knows, and then what are the nice-to-know things that I probably just need to let go of. And so here's an example of how all this worked out in humanities, in Emily's humanities class. So this is, I'm only showing you weeks 1 through 7 of her 15-week semester here, okay? So we have the Renaissance period, weeks 1 through 7, and then the rest of the class was weeks 8 through 15. The schedule was art, and there were 71 slides, 71 samples of art in this class, and they just kind of went through them one by one. And then after a couple of weeks of art, the class moved on to philosophy, and then to literature, and then to music. And this class was multiple sections. The learning outcomes were pretty set, and so was the content. So there wasn't a lot of freedom initially to change this until it was taught in a 6-week compressed format. And so here is the Renaissance period, weeks 1 through 3 of a 6-week format. And Emily, the professor, realized, first of all, she needed to mix things up, So she said, okay, we're going to do art and only 20 slides, and then do some sonnets that relate to that art. And then she moved on to more art, 25 more slides, a little bit of philosophy in the form of philosophical essays, and then more sonnets. And then she moved on to music and integrated Hamlet with that. and then she moved on to music and architecture. So you can see that in the restructuring of this class, Emily really interleaved the content in a very meaningful way. But I also want you to notice that it went from 71 slides to 45 art slides. And so Emily thought through, gosh, I really cannot show 71 slides. What must they know about art, and what are the key slides to show them? What are the key samples to show them in that art? So she did end up needing to give up some content. But this all led to several benefits. So the interleaving of the different kinds of content encouraged comparison and synthesis. Emily introduced some more complex topics early. And this might have been from the student's point of view, but sonnets tend to feel more complex than art slides do. Emily decided to focus on depth over breadth, and that is where the cutting of the slides came from. And then finally, some new class activities were inspired by this rejiggering of the course content, and we'll talk about that right now. So the next thing that's going to happen, and that Emily did do, was to reconfigure the assignments. In the full-length semester class, of course, there were long writing assignments, and there was a full-length term paper, and there were big projects and all that. Well, in the 6-week class, again, there just wasn't time. There wasn't the lead time to be able to get students to turn in large assignments, get feedback on that, and then do another large assignment. So Emily shortened up all the assignments. She broke them up into smaller chunks and had students turn in things very sequentially. She did have incorporated a lot more in-class activities. So you see on the top picture here, all those students are like heads down writing, and on the bottom picture, somebody's standing up talking. So Emily reconfigured at least one of her assignments from a written assignment to a presentation and in-class debate. And that gave her a couple of things. It gave her some in-class activities, which if you're meeting for 4 hours in a day, you definitely want some activity in there, some meaningful activity. And it also allowed the students to develop a relationship, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, how important that is. And then finally, the scope of these projects just had to get smaller. Instead of, for example, having a 20-page term paper, maybe you need to pull that back to a 5-page briefing paper. It gets to the same learning outcomes of research and citing sources and critical thinking, but it is just shorter and easier to write than that 20-page paper. Of course, your discipline may vary, will vary. So think about this in terms of your discipline. Here's an example from programming. Maybe you have a computer programming assignment, and it's an assignment that normally takes, 8 weeks in the quarter because it's a big program that you want students to write. Well, can you shorten that to be a smaller program that students could complete in 2 weeks? That's the kind of thinking that you need to go through. So now we're going to change directions a little bit and talk about positive social behaviors. We talked at the very beginning of this talk about the fact that it's interaction that really makes or breaks a summer compressed class. And if you have good interaction, then it's probably going to be a good class. And if you have bad interaction, not so good a class. So I have 2 principles here, and they are to cultivate student-faculty interaction and to cultivate student-student cooperation and reciprocity. Now, of course, these principles are things that you would want to be doing in any class, not just a 5-week class. But they kind of take on extra importance when your time together is both compressed and there's a lot more of it in any given day or week, okay? So here's a couple of strategies for that. And the first couple strategies I have are about us as the faculty member. So the positive social behaviors need to begin with us. We are the powerful figure in the room, and how we set up the interaction will determine the rest of the interaction. So first of all, use your expert power base. And that means take your authority in the room from the fact that you are the expert in the room, that you know the high quality material, that you have clear material that's based on up-to-date information and your advanced knowledge. Excuse me. Okay, that is where a lot of your authority needs to come from, as opposed to your authority in the room coming from the fact that you're the person who gives the grade. If you're relying on, students doing what you want because you give the grade, that will not lead to a positive social interaction. So the second kind of power base that you want to use is what's called a referent power base, and that's a more human power base. Your open, warm demeanor with personal stories as appropriate. Now, you never want to cross boundaries with students, but deliberately setting out to create rapport with them, and that you're a human being, that is actually a powerful thing to do. The next strategies, a little bit more operational maybe, are to learn your students' names and to help them learn each other's names. And of course, in a large class, that's hard to do, especially in a compressed format. What I like to do in that case is just have name tents that students put their names on, and they set outside on their desk, and then you know their name even if you haven't memorized their name. And the second strategy is to have high quality active learning in each class period, and that would include some in-class peer feedback. And this does a couple of things for you. First of all, if they're actively learning, they are engaging with each other, because that's kind of the definition of active learning. So if you have a 4-hour class, you have to have some active learning in there, because you just can't lecture for 4 hours. Everyone would die, right? So the active learning breaks that up. And also, it's just a more fun way to do things. The third thing it accomplishes for you is you can offload some of that feedback. So we talked about needing to give feedback to students fairly early on in a 5-week class, and lots of it, but you don't have time between classes to be doing all of this grading. Just like they don't have time to do all the reading we might want them to do, we don't have time to do all of the grading that would be necessary. And so what you want to do is incorporate in your active learning strategies, make sure that they are getting feedback from each other about how they're doing. Messaging and academic policies, and this gets to organization now. So here's the two issues that I see. Expectations of difficulty and workload, and absences and makeups. So difficulty and workload, let's start with that. And what students believe about summer school, as our kitten with its head on the keyboard shows us, students have this perception based on kind of cultural mythos that summer school should be easy and fun. It's summer. It shouldn't be that big a deal. What we know about summer school is we need to brace ourselves. Summer school is coming, because the class is still a 4-credit class. If it was 4 credits in quarters, it's a 4-credit class in 5 weeks. That's the same amount of content, or the same content, the same learning objectives, and it's going to be very intense. So really communicating those expectations to students from the very beginning is really important. And again, here are some principles and strategies. So principles are transparency, directness, and explicitness. And my strategies for that are in your syllabus and in the first day, lay out your expectations extremely clearly. This class is a 4-credit class. We will meet face-to-face for 8 hours, and I expect X hours outside of class from you every week. Be very direct about it. And remind them and talk about it again several times. Don't talk about it once and figure everybody's good. You might need to talk about it again. And then we need to support our students to adjust their expectations and their plans. So having students calendar their study time would be a good idea. It might even be something that you do on the first day. Okay, everybody pull out your calendars. We're going to calendar our 5 weeks together. And have them block out the time to work on your class and work on their other class and do whatever else they want to do. And that would be a good investment of time on the first day. Or if you're teaching an online course, that might be one of their first assignments, is to do this and upload a JPEG screenshot of their calendar. So another thing that we can do to support them is to be very organized and provide detailed planning and instructions. So in a 5-week class, there is simply no time for the normal, oh, I couldn't find this in Blackboard, or where is that, or what are we doing, what are we supposed to do, I don't know. There's no time for that. So the more detailed and organized and checklisty we can be in telling students what is expected every day, the better off that we are. That requires a lot of pre-planning on our parts. And in fact, I don't remember if I said this up front, But one of the things that we absolutely have to do is plan out our entire course before the first day. In the 5-week session, you can't think, oh, I'll get to that later. Oh, I'll do my lectures for week 4 during week 1 or 2. You cannot do that. You need to have everything ready to go before the first day of class begins. You really do. And so that leads us to those detailed planning and instructions and having a very organized class experience, which just frees everybody's mind up to do the work of the class. And then finally, as we've already talked about a lot, we need to moderate our plans. Maybe have a little less reading, have our project be a smaller scope. And then finally, absences and makeups are important to think about. Of course, they're important to think about no matter what kind of class you're teaching, but again, in a 5-weeker, even more important. So my principles are to balance the need for flexibility with the need for good attendance, because of course, if students are missing class in a 5-week class, they are missing twice as much as they are missing in a 10-week class. And we also need to balance the need for flexibility with a very short time frame for feedback. Okay, so here are some strategies. First of all, back to planning and organization. Have that fully developed calendar with all the due dates up front so that students can really plan their time well. I would suggest having significant participation credit. If you want attendance, then give participation credit. But have some percentage of that opportunities allowed to be missed for any reason so that your need for makeups is reduced. Now, there's a caveat to that, which is that some medical issues, you may need to allow makeups no matter what, even though you have a flexible policy that says, oh, we have 10 quizzes, you can miss 2 with no problem because I'm only going to count 8. For some medical issues, you need to allow makeups for that. But that's only the medical issues, right? You don't have to allow makeups for everything else, right? You might consider, if it fits in your discipline, having a double deadline for papers or projects. So let's say you have a paper that is due Thursday of week 1. If students turn it in that day, then you will grade it and they will get feedback for their paper that's due on Thursday of week 2, right? But if a student can't turn it in on Thursday of week 1 for some reason, what they might be able to do is tell you, I plan to turn this in on Monday, and here's my plan for being able to turn it in on Monday. When they turn it on Monday, all you do is grade it. You don't give feedback. And then finally, if they miss their Monday, they don't get to turn it in. So this does a couple of things for you. It puts the responsibility for managing the time on the students. It's less punitive than saying 20% off for every day late or whatever your policy is. Now, this is good if it fits your discipline. There are some disciplines, like finance, I recently learned, is a discipline in which deadlines are incredibly important because if you miss a deadline by even a minute, it's millions of dollars. So if you have a discipline that's one of those, by all means, keep those incredibly strict deadlines. But if you have a discipline that allows for a little more flexibility, you might use that to your advantage. And then, of course, having strict attendance for exams will really help you in the 5-week summer class. And one way to do that without having to deal with makeups too much is a strategy that a professor I knew who used to teach 200 people at a time. The in-class exams were multiple choice. All makeup exams were essay. And the requests for makeup exams went from 25 per exam to about 1 per exam after he instituted that policy. So that might be an idea for you. But think through your attendance and makeup policies and how they may need to change for the 5-week. Oops. So thanks for listening to this presentation. Good luck. Not that you need luck, because you'll have done all the preparation that you have, but I do wish you the very best for a very enjoyable summer for both you and your students. Take care.